Story number 1. The House That Doesn't Belong. The Jacobs family had been searching for a home for months, and when they found it, a quiet, secluded house on a peaceful street, they thought their search had finally ended. The house was old, but not too old, with a charm that suggested it had been well taken care of. It had a warm, welcoming aura, a house that seemed to whisper stories of the past. The neighborhood was perfect too, neat rows of houses, manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors who greeted them with smiles. But from the moment they stepped inside, things felt off. At first, it was just small things. The living room seemed a little smaller than it should have been, considering the size of the exterior. The kitchen had a peculiar layout, and the staircase that led upstairs was too steep, its narrow steps making an odd creaking sound whenever someone climbed them. "I'm sure it's just an old house," Rachel said, trying to reassure her husband, Tom. "We'll get used to it." But as days passed, the oddities only increased. They noticed that the hallway, which had seemed so straightforward at first, twisted in unexpected directions. What they had thought was a simple 4-bedroom house became an unpredictable maze. At night, when they stumbled through the darkened corridors searching for the bathroom, they often found themselves standing in a room they didn't recognize. "How did we end up here?" Tom would mutter, rubbing his tired eyes. "This hallway wasn't here before." Rachel laughed nervously, thinking it must be fatigue or some trick of the light, but deep down, a cold feeling was creeping up her spine. She wasn't so sure anymore. It wasn't long before they discovered something more troubling. The doors. They would open one door, expecting to see the bedroom they had entered earlier, only to find a completely different room. It was as if the house was rearranging itself when they weren't looking. The master bedroom, which had been just down the hall, had vanished, replaced by a small, dusty room with no windows. The bathroom was now on the opposite side of the house, behind a door that hadn't been there the day before. The children, Emma and Luke, started to complain. They would come running down the stairs in a panic, saying the house had changed while they were playing. "The walls moved," Luke cried one night, his face pale with fear. "The kitchen door was there, and now it's gone. It's like the house doesn't want us to leave." Rachel, her concern growing by the day, began to research the house's history. She found nothing. No records, no previous owners, no real history at all. The house was a mystery, one that was hidden even in the town's archives. And yet, it was as if the house was always meant to be there, occupying space where it shouldn't have been. Tom tried to reason with her. "We're overthinking this. It's just an old house. Old houses do weird things." But Rachel could feel it. There was something sinister about the house. It wasn't just the shifting walls or the sudden appearance of new rooms. It was the way it seemed to know them, to follow them. When they would try to leave, go to the store, visit friends, anything, the house felt heavier, as though it were holding them hostage. Every time they returned, the front door would creak open with an almost deliberate slowness, as if waiting for them to cross the threshold, trapping them inside once again. The strangest part came one night when Rachel couldn't sleep. She walked down the hallway clutching her robe tightly around her, listening to the strange creaks and groans of the house. As she passed one of the doors, she stopped. The room inside looked like their living room, but with something terribly wrong. The furniture was arranged differently, more sparse, almost clinical. And there, standing at the far end of the room, was a shadow, dark and featureless. She gasped and reached for the doorknob, but it slipped out of her hand as if it were coated in oil. The shadow turned to face her, though it had no face, no features, just darkness, a void that seemed to pull at her very soul. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of decay. Before she could react, the shadow spoke in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but a sensation that echoed through her bones. "Leave." Rachel backed away, heart pounding in her chest, and ran straight into Tom, who had followed her down the hall. He looked at her, confusion in his eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked. Before she could answer, a low groan reverberated through the walls, deep and guttural, like the house was breathing. The entire house seemed to shift then, a subtle but undeniable movement, as if the foundation itself was alive. Over the next few days, Rachel and Tom couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just a little quirky. The house was alive, and it had its own plans for them. It didn't belong in this neighborhood, in this town, in this time, and it didn't want them to leave. Emma and Luke, who had started to grow quiet and withdrawn, now refused to go into certain rooms. "They're watching," Emma whispered one night, clinging to her mother's side. "The rooms are alive, like the walls are watching us." Story number 2. The Unseen Room. When Dan Morgan bought the old house at the auction, he didn't expect much. The place was a wreck, peeling wallpaper, cracked floors, and a sagging roof. But it was cheap, and Dan had a knack for turning these old places around. He was used to seeing potential where others only saw decay, and with a little time, some paint, and a few tools, he could make it livable again, sell it for a profit, and move on to the next project. The house was located on the outskirts of town, isolated by overgrown trees and a winding dirt road that hardly anyone used anymore. That was part of its charm. The house was old, probably built sometime in the early 1900s, but the bones were solid, and Dan had already made plans for the renovation. He had to fix the foundation, repair the wiring, and modernize the plumbing, but that was standard for a place like this. He began his work in the basement, tearing down old wooden beams and clearing out debris. It was dirty, heavy work, but he enjoyed it. The house had a certain quiet about it, almost as if it were waiting for him to wake it up. It was a peaceful sort of solitude that made him forget the world outside, where he had a life he was constantly trying to outrun. One evening, while taking measurements in the upper floor, he came across something odd. It was a wall, a solid, unmarked wall that shouldn't have been there. There were no doors, no windows, nothing to indicate that this part of the house existed. At first, Dan thought it was just an old closet or a small storage space that had been bricked over long ago. But as he examined the area, something felt wrong. The wall didn't line up with the rest of the house. The angles were off, and the texture of the wood was different from the rest of the room. Dan's curiosity was piqued. He decided to remove the old, crumbling plaster to see what was hidden behind it. It took him hours, but when the final layer came off, he found something unexpected. It wasn't just a closet. It was a room. A full, empty room. One that seemed to have always been there, as if it had never been hidden at all. The floor was covered in dust, the air stagnant and heavy with time. There were no windows, no doors leading to it from any other part of the house. The room didn't make any sense. It felt wrong. Like something had been sealed away, and now, after years of silence, it was waiting for him. At first, Dan thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe the original builders had left it unfinished, or maybe it was an old storage area that had been forgotten over time. But as he stood in the middle of the room, something made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was a presence in that room, something unsettling. It was as if the space was aware of him, watching him, even though it was empty. He tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just the isolation of the house playing tricks on him. He needed to get to work, finish the renovations, and move on. But the room lingered in his thoughts, its emptiness like a persistent whisper at the back of his mind. As the days went on, Dan couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. The room was always there, just out of sight, waiting. He would sometimes hear strange noises at night, scratching sounds, muffled whispers. But when he checked the house, he found nothing. It was always quiet, as if nothing had happened at all. Eventually, he decided to investigate the history of the house. The local library had a small archive of old town records, and Dan spent an afternoon going through them. He found nothing about the house that was particularly unusual, except for one thing. There was no mention of the room, not a single word. The house had been sold several times over the years, but none of the previous owners had reported anything out of the ordinary. It was as though that room had never existed. The deeper he dug into the past, the more he began to feel a sense of foreboding. He discovered that the original owner of the house, a man named Albert Moore, had disappeared under strange circumstances. No one knew what had happened to him, and the house had been abandoned for years before it was sold to another family. Dan found this information buried in an old news article from the 1940s. The strange part was that Albert Moore had lived in the house for nearly 20 years, but there were no records of his death. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. The more Dan thought about it, the more he began to feel a creeping sense of familiarity. There was something about the house that tugged at him, something that made him feel like he had been here before. He couldn't quite place it, but it was as if the house and the room had been waiting for him. One night, after a long day of work, Dan couldn't resist the urge to return to the room. He went upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house, and stood in front of the hidden wall once again. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. This time, the room felt different. It wasn't just empty, it felt alive, as though it was breathing with him. The silence was oppressive, heavy with 1,000 unspoken words. And then, as he stood there, a memory surfaced, a forgotten moment from his childhood. It was blurry at first, but as it sharpened, he remembered something terrifying. He had been here before, not in this house, but in this room. Dan's heart raced as he recalled the night he had wandered away from his parents when he was a child, lost in a strange house. This house. He had seen the same room as a boy, the same walls, the same silence. It had been waiting for him then, too. Suddenly, the door behind him slammed shut, and the room grew darker, colder. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned to face the walls, realizing too late that he had never truly left this place. The room had always been a part of him, part of his past, a dark memory that had followed him into adulthood. The walls seemed to close in, and Dan felt the weight of something far older than the house pressing down on him. He wasn't just trapped in a room. He was trapped in his own history, his own twisted fate. The room hadn't been hidden from the world. It had been hidden from him. The house wasn't just alive. It was his house, his past, and now it was ready to claim him once and for all. Story number 3. The clock that stopped. When Claire and David first laid eyes on the old house, it was everything they had dreamed of. Located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by tall trees and a thick mist that always seemed to linger, the house was grand. Old but sturdy, with intricate woodwork and stone walls that whispered of history. They knew they could restore it to its former glory. The price was right too good to pass up. But what they didn't expect was the clock. It stood in the entryway, towering above them. A massive grandfather clock with a beautifully carved oak frame. It was the kind of clock that belonged in a museum. The kind of clock that everyone would admire. But when Claire walked closer and looked at the face, her heart skipped a beat. It was stuck. The second hand was frozen at 3:33, "Maybe it's broken," David said, standing beside her. Claire nodded, but something about the way the clock's hands pointed directly to that time gave her an unsettling feeling. It wasn't just a broken clock. It felt like something deliberate, as if it was waiting for them. The time seemed wrong somehow, frozen, suspended in the middle of something they couldn't quite understand. For the first few days, they tried to fix it. They wound it up, cleaned the mechanism, and checked the gears. But no matter what they did, it wouldn't budge. The second hand refused to move. The minute hand remained stubbornly on the 33. It was as if the clock was refusing to work, like it had some purpose it wasn't ready to share. And then, things started happening. At first, it was just small things. A light bulb flickering in the hallway. A shadow moving out of the corner of Claire's eye when she was alone in the kitchen. The strange, almost imperceptible sound of footsteps behind her when no one was there. She thought it was her imagination, the house settling, or maybe even just the wind playing tricks with her mind. But it didn't stop. It escalated. The lights would flicker on and off at odd times, always when the clock showed exactly 3:33. Claire and David tried changing the bulbs, resetting the fuse box, but nothing worked. The flickering didn't just happen in one room. It spread throughout the house, following them as they moved from one room to the next, as if the house was responding to something deep inside the walls. Then the footsteps started. Soft at first, barely audible, but as time went on they grew louder, more distinct. The sound of shoes shuffling across the old hardwood floors echoed down the hall. Claire would run to check, but every time there was nothing, no one. The house was empty. One night, as the clock struck 3:33 once again, the temperature in the house dropped. Claire was in the living room when she noticed the chill creeping in, as if a cold draft had settled around her. She shivered and wrapped her arms around herself, but the cold didn't go away. In fact, it seemed to intensify. It was as if the room was slowly being pulled into another time, another place where the normal rules didn't apply. David joined her in the living room, noticing the same thing. "It's freezing in here," he said, pulling on his jacket. The clock was still frozen at 3:33. "I don't like this," Claire whispered, her voice shaky. "Something's not right with this house, David. I think it's tied to the clock. It's like time itself is stuck here." David didn't want to believe her at first. He tried to chalk it up to stress, to the house settling, to their imaginations running wild. But the more they stayed there, the more they experienced, the harder it was to ignore the connection between the clock and the strange happenings around them. The house seemed to move on its own, as though it were shifting, bending, warping in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Walls seemed to grow closer, rooms rearranged when they weren't looking, and once or twice, Claire swore she'd seen doors that hadn't been there before. Then came the night when it all became too real. Claire had just gone to bed, the house silent around her, when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps again, slow and deliberate, approaching her bedroom door. She lay still, holding her breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. She reached for the light switch, but before she could move, the door creaked open. It wasn't David standing there. It was something else. A figure, draped in shadow, stood in the doorway. The face was indistinct, but the eyes, Claire would never forget the eyes. They were dark, hollow, as if they belonged to something that wasn't quite human, something trapped between time and space. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring at her. Who are you?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling with fear. But it didn't answer. It didn't need to. The figure simply stepped back, disappearing into the darkness of the hall. Claire rushed out of bed, heart pounding. But by the time she reached the hallway, the figure was gone. And then she heard it. The ticking. The soft, rhythmic ticking of the clock, which had been silent for so long. It was moving again. But when she looked at the clock, she saw something even more terrifying. The time hadn't changed at all. It was still 3:33, but the hands were moving in reverse, slowly ticking backward, dragging them back into something they couldn't understand. The house seemed to hum with energy, as if it were alive, pulling them further into the past. David joined her in the hallway, and together they stared at the clock, both of them unable to move. "That's impossible," David said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "It can't be." But it was. Time was slipping away, and the house, this house, had somehow become a prison for them. A prison built on the foundation of a moment, forever frozen in time. The footsteps started again, this time from all directions, around them, beneath them, above them, growing louder, faster, until it felt like the house was closing in on them, consuming them. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were alive with the ticking of the clock. And then, everything stopped. The clock struck 3:33 once more, but this time, it wasn't just the clock that was frozen. It was them, too. Claire and David stood motionless in the hallway, trapped in that moment, unable to move, unable to escape. Time had stopped. And so had they. Story number 4. The Portrait. Mia had always been drawn to the unusual, the forgotten places in life. So, when she heard about the old mansion on the outskirts of town, she couldn't resist. It had been abandoned for decades, the kind of house that whispered secrets through the cracks in its walls. People said it was haunted, cursed, or simply too far gone to care about. But Mia was a historian, a lover of old stories, and she saw it as a mystery waiting to be unraveled. The mansion sat alone at the edge of a dense forest, its windows dark and its stone facade crumbling from years of neglect. Mia stepped up to the front door, pushing it open with a creak that sounded too loud in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. The mansion seemed to breathe, every step Mia took resonating like the house was alive, observing her. She had come to investigate the history of the place. Who had lived here? What had happened to them? As she walked through the empty halls, her flashlight casting long, trembling shadows, she felt a strange sensation. It was as if the house itself had been waiting for someone to walk through its doors. The first thing Mia noticed was a portrait hanging on the wall at the end of the long corridor. The frame was old and gilded, but the painting itself was striking. It depicted a family, a mother, father, and 2 children, standing together in front of the mansion, smiling as if they were posing for a photograph. There was nothing particularly unusual about the family. They looked like any family from decades ago, well-dressed, poised, their smiles frozen in time. But something about them felt wrong. Mia's hand hovered over the frame, and her breath caught. The mother in the painting had a look in her eyes, a deep, haunting sorrow that seemed to pierce through the canvas. The father's smile was too wide, his eyes too sharp, almost predatory. The children, standing close to each other, seemed oddly stiff, as if they were holding back something dark. Mia couldn't explain it, but she felt like she knew them. It started as a flicker, a brief, unsettling thought that she'd seen their faces before. Maybe in a history book or a photograph somewhere. But the more she stared at the painting, the more familiar their faces became. The mother's sad eyes, the father's unnatural smile, the children's stiff postures. It was like something deep within her was tugging at her memory, something that she couldn't quite grasp. As she continued her research in the mansion, Mia began to feel more and more unsettled. Every room she explored seemed to mirror something in the painting. The furniture, the drapes, the colors. It was as if everything in the house had been frozen in time, exactly as it was when the family had lived there. She began to spend more time at the mansion, studying old letters, journals, and photographs left behind. Each day, she uncovered more details about the family. The mansion had belonged to the Wellingtons, a wealthy family that had lived there for generations. The records told of their lavish lifestyle, their tragic downfall, and then nothing. It was as if they had disappeared overnight. The town records stopped mentioning them, and no one could recall what had happened to them. But the more Mia learned, the more she realized something wasn't right. The Wellingtons hadn't just vanished, they had been forgotten, erased from history. There were no death certificates, no funeral records, just a gap, a blank space in time. The more she studied the painting, the more she began to recognize the family in her dreams. At night, Mia would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, when the dreams would begin. She would see the Wellingtons, always in the same positions, always in the same room. The mother's sad eyes would turn toward her. The father's smile would widen into something unnatural. The children, always staring directly at her, would beckon her closer. And in every dream she could hear them whispering, calling her name in voices that didn't sound like her own. Each night, the dreams became more vivid, more intense. Mia would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, but the images from the dream would stay with her, lingering even in the light of day. One afternoon, while poring through the mansion's library, Mia found an old diary hidden in the back of a dusty shelf. It belonged to the mother in the painting, Eleanor Wellington. As she read through the entries, a chilling realization crept over her. Eleanor wrote about a terrible curse, one that had plagued her family for generations. The curse was tied to the house, to the painting itself. The family had been trapped in time, frozen in the portrait, unable to escape. Mia's pulse quickened as she read the final entry, written just before the family disappeared. We cannot escape. Time is no longer our own. We are bound to this place, to this moment. And now, it seems that someone else is coming, someone who will take our place. If you find this, do not stay. Leave while you can. Mia's blood ran cold. It wasn't just the family in the painting that had been trapped. It was anyone who came into the house, anyone who became drawn to the portrait. And now, Mia realized with growing horror, the Wellingtons were calling to her. They had been waiting for her, just as they had waited for anyone else who might step into the house. The realization hit her all at once. The painting, the family, the house, it was all connected. The Wellingtons had been trapped in that moment, forever bound to the painting. And Mia was the next one to take their place. As the sun began to set, Mia stood in front of the portrait, staring at the faces she now recognized so well. The mother's sad eyes seemed to look deeper, as if she was trying to warn her. The father's smile twisted, dark and knowing. And the children stared back at her, not as strangers but as part of a nightmare she couldn't escape. Mia's vision blurred, and she reached out, her fingers brushing the frame. And as she did, the house seemed to pulse, the walls groaning with the weight of time. She could hear them now, voices, whispers, calls that were not her own. The Wellingtons were waiting. And as the room began to fade, as the world around her slipped away, Mia understood. She was no longer a visitor. She was part of the portrait. Story number 5. The repeating day. Dan woke up with a sharp, disorienting feeling, like he was somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. The sunlight slanted through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the unfamiliar room. He blinked a few times, taking in the surroundings. A bed he didn't recognize, a dresser with old photographs he didn't remember, and walls painted in a shade of blue that felt oddly calming. He sat up slowly, shaking off the fog of sleep, and rubbed his eyes. His clothes, what he had on now, seemed like his own, but everything felt off, like a dream that was trying too hard to feel real. He got out of bed and walked to the door. The house outside the room was quiet, too quiet. It had that strange, still atmosphere, like everything was holding its breath. Dan stepped into the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. He paused, listening. The place was empty, no voices, no sounds, just the steady hum of silence. He walked into the living room, where a clock on the wall ticked steadily. It was an old-fashioned clock, with ornate brass hands that seemed too delicate for its size. Dan looked at it for a moment, and then his eyes narrowed. It was 8 a.m. The time seemed fine, but something about it felt wrong. He couldn't quite place why. Maybe it was the stillness of the house or the fact that he had no memory of how he had ended up here. He decided to check the rest of the house, to see if he could make sense of things. It was a small, two-story home, sparsely decorated with an odd combination of furniture. Nothing felt familiar, but nothing felt entirely out of place either. As he moved into the kitchen, the first strange thing happened. The picture on the wall of a happy family at a picnic changed. The man in the photograph was smiling one moment, and then, in a blink, his expression shifted, his face now twisted in an uncomfortable grimace. Dan stared at it for a moment, unsure if he had really seen it change, but when he looked again, everything was back to normal. The man was smiling again. Dan shook his head. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him. He needed to focus, needed to figure out where he was. He grabbed his phone from his pocket and dialed his friend's number, hoping for some clarity. But when the call went through, the voice on the other end wasn't the one he expected. "Hello?" The voice was distorted, crackling as if coming from a broken connection. "Hello?" Dan asked, confused. "Who is this? This is Dan." The line went silent for a moment, and then the voice responded in a slow, deliberate tone. "You can't leave. Not yet, not today." Dan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What's going on?" But before he could get another word in, the line went dead. He stared at his phone, frozen, his mind racing. What the hell was happening? He hurried to the front door, desperate to get out, but when he tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, then shoved, but the door remained locked. Panic set in. He checked all the windows, but they were all sealed shut, as if the house had been designed to keep him inside. His mind raced. He couldn't understand it. There was nothing about this house that made sense. And then it hit him. It was the clock. It had been 8 a.m. when he first looked at it. And now it was 8 a.m. again, the same time, the same moment. He checked the clocks in every room, and they were all the same, frozen at 8 o'clock. Confused and growing more desperate, he turned toward the staircase, trying to calm his thoughts. But then the phone rang. He froze, unsure if he wanted to answer it. Part of him knew it was the same voice from before, the one that had told him not to leave. With trembling hands, he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" The voice, distorted as before, answered. "You can't escape. It's already begun. You'll wake up again, and it will be the same, and again until you understand." The line went silent. Dan dropped the phone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stepped back, his pulse pounding in his ears. Something was happening to him. Something that made no sense. He looked at the clock again. 8 a.m. His stomach turned. His heart raced. Was this some kind of nightmare? A prank? But everything felt too real. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding him in place, controlling the flow of time. He needed to leave. He had to get out. But when he opened the door again, he found himself back in the same room, the same hallway, the same clock, still ticking at 8 a.m. Time had reset. Dan's breath caught in his throat. He tried to fight it, tried to run again, but the same thing happened. The phone rang. The distorted voice told him again, "You'll wake up again." And again and again. It was happening over and over. The same moments, the same events trapped in a loop. He could feel it. He was stuck. Stuck in this house, in this moment, unable to escape. He could hear the voice again, taunting him, whispering to him that this was how it was going to be now. Trapped in time. Forever repeating the same day, over and over again. Dan fell to his knees, his mind screaming for release, for anything to break the cycle. But the house, the clocks, the voice, they were all there, waiting, watching. And with a sickening realization, he understood. He wasn't just trapped in the house. He was trapped in time itself. And he would never leave. Story number 6. The Uninvited Guest. The Wilsons were thrilled when they finally moved into their new home. After years of searching, they had found the perfect house. A spacious, 2-story building tucked away on a quiet street at the edge of town. The house had charm, with its old wooden floors, tall windows, and a fireplace that looked like something out of a cozy movie scene. It was everything they had dreamed of. At first, things went smoothly. The family, Tom, his wife Sarah, and their 2 kids, Emily and Ben, spent the first few days unpacking and settling in, laughing and chatting as they decorated each room. The house felt warm, inviting, and full of potential. But as the days passed, a strange unease began to grow. Slowly at first, like a shadow creeping through the corners of the house. It started with the footsteps. Tom was the first to hear them. He was in the kitchen one night cleaning up after dinner when he heard someone walking around upstairs. It wasn't heavy, deliberate steps, but light, quick footsteps, almost like someone was pacing. He froze, listening. But when he went upstairs to check, the house was empty. Emily and Ben were playing in their rooms, and Sarah was reading in the living room. Tom chalked it up to an old house settling, or maybe it was just the wind. He didn't want to worry Sarah over something that could easily be explained. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more insistent, and started happening when no one was near. Sarah heard them too, while she was folding laundry in the bedroom, or while she was in the kitchen making breakfast. The sound of light footsteps moving from one end of the house to the other, only to stop when she rushed to investigate. Then there were the whispers. At first, it was hard to make out anything clearly, just soft murmurs, like a conversation happening in the next room. But every time Sarah or Tom tried to pinpoint where the sound was coming from, they found nothing. The whispers would vanish, leaving the air feeling cold, almost oppressive. There was a sensation in certain rooms, especially in the hallway and the upstairs study, like something was watching them, something unseen, waiting. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Sarah found a small, old journal tucked away in the attic. It was hidden beneath a pile of old blankets in the corner, the pages yellowed with age. Curious, she opened it and began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Harold Monroe, a previous tenant who had lived in the house many years ago. Sarah learned that Harold had moved into the house with his wife, but soon after, strange things began happening. The whispers, the cold rooms, the footsteps. All of it sounded so familiar. As Sarah read on, she came across a passage that made her blood run cold. The house is not empty, It never has been. There is someone here, someone who was never invited, and they feed off our fear. I can feel it getting stronger every day, every hour. It waits, watching, and when the time comes, it will take us. It will take me, and then it will take her. God help us, I don't know how much longer we can stay." Sarah's hand trembled as she turned the page, but what she found only deepened the mystery. "I don't know who he is, I've never seen him. But I hear his footsteps at night, and I hear him whispering in the walls. I don't think I'm going to make it out of here. I'm so scared. I can't stop looking over my shoulder, and it's getting harder to breathe. There's a dark presence in this house, a man who was never invited, but who has lived here for years. He feeds off our fear, and he gets stronger every time we are afraid. I think he's waiting for us to make a mistake. Please, God, if anyone finds this journal, don't come here." The last entry in the journal was a simple one. I can hear him now. It's too late. Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the weight of the house pressing in on her, its air heavy with something unspoken, something ancient. She rushed downstairs to tell Tom, but when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. Tom stood in the hallway, looking toward the darkened study at the end of the hall. He was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Tom?" she called softly, her voice trembling. Tom didn't respond. Instead, he pointed toward the study with a shaking hand. In the dim light, Sarah saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the study, tall, shadowy, and featureless. The figure was still, like a statue, but it wasn't empty. She could feel it, the same oppressive presence that had been following them. It was waiting, just as Harold Monroe had written. The whispering started again, this time louder, more distinct, rising from the walls around them. Sarah turned toward Tom, but he was no longer standing next to her. He was halfway down the hallway, his eyes glazed over, his movements stiff and slow, like he wasn't controlling them. "Tom!" she screamed, rushing toward him. "Get away from it! Get away from the study!" But it was too late. The figure, the uninvited guest, moved with unnatural speed, its form growing darker and more solid as it advanced on them. The air turned icy cold, and Sarah could feel the weight of the house's darkness pressing in on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a whisper in her ear, a voice that sounded so familiar and so far away. "You should have never come." When Sarah woke up, the house was silent. The figure was gone. Tom was gone. Emily and Ben were gone. Everything was gone. The house was empty again, except for the footsteps, and the whispers, and the uninvited guest waiting. Story number 7. The house that knows Mark had never expected to inherit anything. He was the black sheep of the family, the one who'd drifted away from relatives he barely knew. When the letter came, telling him he had inherited his late uncle's house, he was taken aback. He hadn't spoken to his uncle in over a decade, not since that argument that had torn their family apart. The house wasn't big, but it was old, tucked away in a quiet part of town, and Mark wasn't sure what to expect. Still, there was a strange pull, a sense of curiosity that tugged at him. When Mark first arrived at the house, he immediately felt something strange. The moment he stepped onto the front porch, a sense of familiarity washed over him, as if he had been there before. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet as he stepped inside, and the air smelled musty, thick with the scent of time and dust. The house looked almost like he imagined it would. Antique furniture, faded wallpaper, and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. But it didn't feel like a place he'd never been. It felt like it knew him. He walked through the rooms, a vague unease crawling under his skin. The furniture seemed to be exactly where it should be, and yet there was an odd sensation in the air, as if the house was observing him, waiting. The feeling grew stronger the longer he stayed. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracked windows, felt intentional, as if the house had been anticipating his arrival. In the living room, he froze. There, hanging on the wall, was a photograph of a young boy. Mark blinked, his chest tightening. The boy looked familiar, but he couldn't place him. He studied the photo, leaning in closer. The face of the child was his own. A shiver ran down his spine. His mind reeled. He didn't remember ever being this young, or ever living in this house. But the boy in the picture was him. How was that possible? Mark quickly turned away, trying to shake off the unease that was beginning to grip him. He walked into the kitchen, where another odd sensation hit him. He was flooded with images, flashes of memories that weren't his own. A woman's voice, calling his name. A man's stern face, his hand gripping his shoulder. Then, the image of himself sitting at the kitchen table as a young boy, looking up at a figure that was too blurry to make out. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, his heart racing. The air felt heavier, thick with something he couldn't explain. His vision blurred for a moment, and he blinked rapidly to clear it. The house felt like it was pushing him deeper into these memories, like it was drawing something out of him, something long buried. That night, as he lay in the guest bedroom, Mark couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, the house's strange atmosphere pressing on him from all sides. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those flashes again, the boy in the picture, the blurry figure, the voices. They all felt so real, like fragments of something he should have remembered, something that belonged to him. But they weren't his. Were they? The next day, he started digging through his uncle's old things, hoping to find some answers. It didn't take long before he found a small, dusty box tucked away in a cabinet. Inside, there were old journals, faded papers, and a letter from his uncle, written just before his death. The letter was short, cryptic. "This house remembers. It knows us all. Be careful what you uncover, Mark." Mark's breath caught in his throat. The house? What did that mean? What was it trying to tell him? He began reading through the journals, each entry darker than the last. His uncle wrote about the house as if it were alive, as if it had a mind of its own. There were stories of people who had lived there, all of them leaving with fractured minds. One man, his uncle wrote, had disappeared completely, his body never found. Another woman, who had stayed too long, had gone mad, convinced that the house was feeding on her memories. His uncle had tried to leave, but something kept pulling him back, a force that seemed to bind him to the house, forcing him to relive the darkest parts of his past over and over. And then, Mark found it, his uncle's final entry. "I can feel it now. It's pulling me deeper. It knows my secrets, all of them. It forces me to relive them. Every mistake, every regret, every fear. The house has become me, and I've become it. And now, it wants Mark." Mark's head spun. What was this? How could his uncle know he would be here? How could he know that this house had such a hold on him? The more Mark thought about it, the more he realized that his uncle's fate had been sealed the moment he stepped inside. And now, it seemed, it was his turn. He stood up, the weight of the house pressing in on him, suffocating him. He turned toward the door but stopped. There, standing in the hallway, was the same boy from the photograph. Only this time, he was real. Alive. The boy's eyes locked onto his, and Mark froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The boy smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and then he spoke, his voice faint and distant. "You're not leaving, Mark," the boy whispered. "Not until you remember." The house seemed to pulse around him, and Mark's mind began to unravel. The house knew him. It knew his secrets, his deepest fears, and it was waiting for him to confront them. It wasn't just memories it wanted control, and it would never let him go. Mark turned and ran, but the doors wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. The house had already taken him, and it was too late to escape. The house that knew him, that knew all of them, had claimed another soul. And now, it would make him relive it all. Forever. Story number 8. The House at the Edge of Town. It was just another dare. The kind of thing you do when you're young, bored, and looking for something to give you a thrill. But for Noah, Sarah, Ben, and Emma, the house at the edge of town had become a myth. A whisper passed between friends about the abandoned house, standing for centuries, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed shut. Everyone in town knew about it. No one ever dared to go near it, and that made it all the more tempting. One chilly evening in late autumn, the group gathered at Noah's house, the idea of the house becoming a joke among them. "It's just an old house," Noah said, tossing a rock into the air, catching it. "It's not like it's haunted, people just made it up." "Yeah, right," Emma said, rolling her eyes. "It's the oldest trick in the book. Abandoned house, creepy stories. I bet we'll find some old furniture and a bunch of dust. Maybe even some rats." She laughed, but there was a nervousness in her voice. "Let's do it," Ben said, the usual skeptic of the group, but he was already grinning. "We'll prove it's nothing." And so, they made their way toward the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkening woods. The closer they got, the more the house seemed to loom in the distance, its silhouette rising from the shadows like some forgotten beast. It stood on the outskirts of town, hidden by thick trees and twisted vines, its tall stone walls covered in grime and moss. The windows were dark, the glass cracked and boarded up with rotting planks. No lights flickered inside, and the air felt heavy around it, like the house itself was watching them, waiting. "Here it is," Noah whispered, stepping forward. They all paused at the gate, their feet dragging in the thick grass as they stared at the house, a chill creeping down their spines. The stories they'd heard, strange lights in the windows, eerie sounds at night, people who had gone in and never returned the same, seemed less like just stories now. "Let's just go inside and see," Ben said, his voice shaking slightly despite his bravado. He gripped the rusty iron gate and pulled it open with a loud creak. They walked up the overgrown path, the door to the house standing before them like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Noah grabbed a crowbar from the backpack they had brought, and with a few grunts pried open the door. It came free with a terrible screech that echoed through the trees, making them all jump. They stepped inside. The air inside the house was thick and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. The house smelled of mold, old wood, and something else. A sour metallic scent that seemed to linger in the back of their throats. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, the sound stretching into the dark, empty spaces of the house. They walked slowly, their flashlights flickering against the walls as they explored. The first thing they noticed was the silence. There were no sounds, no wind rustling through the trees, no animal scurrying through the walls. It was as if the house had swallowed the outside world whole. "This place is creepy as hell," Emma muttered, shivering despite herself. They came to the first room, a living room by the looks of it. The furniture was ancient, covered in thick layers of dust and cobwebs, but it was the shadows that caught their attention. They moved unnaturally, swirling in the corners of the room, stretching longer than they should. Ben was the first to notice. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Noah frowned. "See what?" "Over there," Ben pointed to the corner. "The shadow, it moved." Sarah stared at the dark corner, but the shadow was still. Just as Noah was about to dismiss it, a soft whisper reached their ears. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Everyone stopped, listening. The whisper was faint at first, like the rustling of paper, but then it grew louder. A voice, a low, insistent murmur. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was as if the house itself was speaking, beckoning them deeper. Suddenly, the room felt colder. The air thickened, pressing against them, and the shadows stretched farther, closer, until they could no longer see the corners of the room. "Let's get out of here," Emma said, backing away. "This is bad. This isn't just an old house. Something's wrong." But it was too late. The door they had entered through slammed shut with a force that shook the house. Their flashlights flickered and died. Panic spread through the group like wildfire. "No, no, no, no!" Ben yelled, trying to open the door. It was locked. The shadows in the room began to shift again, swirling around them in dizzying patterns. And then the whispers began to speak louder, clearer. "Stay, stay, stay." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside their heads, a low hum that made their skin crawl. "What is this? What's happening?" Sarah cried out, clutching Noah's arm. But Noah was no longer paying attention. He was staring at the far wall where a large, faded portrait hung. The faces in the painting were distorted, their features twisted in agony. But what made Noah's heart freeze in his chest was the familiar face in the portrait. It was his own. "No," Noah whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "That's me. That's—" A shadow lunged out of the corner, faster than he could react, and grabbed him by the throat, pulling him into the dark. The others screamed, rushing forward, but the shadow pulled him deeper, his feet dragging along the floor, his body convulsing as though fighting against an invisible force. In an instant, Noah vanished into the darkness. The room fell silent again. Ben, Sarah, and Emma stood frozen, hearts pounding. They looked at the spot where Noah had just been, but there was no sign of him. The shadows had swallowed him whole. The house had claimed him. Then they heard it again, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't a request, it was a command. "Stay." And as the shadows closed in around them, they understood. The house had been waiting for them. For centuries, it had been waiting. And now, it would never let them leave. Story number 9. The 4th floor. Jenna and Mark were excited when they found the apartment. It was affordable, spacious, and in a quiet, almost forgotten part of the city. The building was old, sure, but there was a charm to it. Wooden floors that creaked with age, high ceilings, and windows that let in just the right amount of sunlight. After weeks of searching for the perfect place to settle in, they both knew it was the one. But from the moment they moved in, something didn't feel quite right. It started small. The lights in the hallway flickered at odd times. Sometimes the bulbs would buzz or dim, like they were struggling to stay on. Then, there were the drafts. Jenna would find herself shivering unexpectedly, even when the weather was warm. It wasn't the kind of cold you'd expect from a window left open. It was a deep, biting cold that seemed to seep from the walls. At first, they brushed it off as the quirks of an old building. But then came the noises. Late at night, when the city outside was quiet, they would hear scraping sounds, like something moving behind the walls. It sounded like nails on wood or something heavier, maybe furniture being dragged across the floor. Mark thought it was just rats in the walls, but the sounds never stopped, even when they sealed up the cracks and checked for any obvious damage. One evening, after another night of strange sounds and flickering lights, Jenna couldn't ignore it anymore. "Mark, we need to figure out what's going on. I'm getting weird vibes from this place." Mark shrugged. more out of frustration than concern. "It's just an old building, nothing to worry about." But when Jenna insisted, Mark agreed to ask the landlord. The landlord, an elderly man named Mr. Blake, had a habit of avoiding their questions, but this time they needed answers. The moment they asked about the strange noises and the flickering lights, Mr. Blake became tense. His face, usually calm and friendly, seemed to tighten. He took a slow breath and muttered, "The building only has 3 floors, no more. There's nothing up top. The 3rd floor is the top one." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "But we've seen a 4th floor. We've seen the door." Mr. Blake stiffened, looking over his shoulder before lowering his voice. "I'm telling you, there's nothing there. There's no 4th floor. I suggest you focus on what's inside your apartment and leave it at that." His response felt dismissive, but more importantly, it felt like he was hiding something. Jenna and Mark exchanged a look. The next evening, they decided to investigate for themselves. The door to the 4th floor had always been locked. It was a thick wooden door at the end of a narrow hallway, with peeling paint and a brass doorknob that looked too new for the building. They had tried knocking on it, but no one ever answered. The idea of breaking in felt absurd, but the more they thought about it, the more they couldn't shake the feeling that the 4th floor held the answers. One night, after Mr. Blake had gone home, they grabbed a set of tools and tried their best to pry open the door. It took them nearly an hour, but eventually the door gave way with a groan of protest, swinging open into the dark. The stairs up were narrow, steep, and creaked under their weight. The air was thick with dust, and a strange, almost sweet smell hung in the air, like something decaying just out of sight. When they reached the top, they stood in front of another door. This one made of metal and heavy, like something meant to keep people out. "Do you really want to do this?" Mark asked, his voice a little strained. Jenna nodded, her face pale but determined. "We need to know." With one final push, they opened the door, and what they found inside made them both freeze. The floor was nothing like the rest of the building. It was pristine, too perfect, and the walls gleamed with a sickly, unnatural light. It was like they had stepped into a different world entirely. There were no windows, no signs of life, but the air was heavy with the feeling of being watched. Then they saw them. At first, it was just one figure standing in the corner. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its skin was pale, almost translucent. Its eyes, black and wide, locked onto Jenna and Mark with a hunger that sent a chill through their bones. Slowly, more figures emerged from the shadows, dozens of them, all with the same hollow eyes and pale, almost skeletal features. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she realized they weren't human. Not fully. There was something wrong with their faces, something distorted, as if their very form had been twisted, not by time, but by something darker. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. "We've been waiting for you," it said, its voice like a whisper in the back of their minds, cold and suffocating. Mark backed away, his heart pounding. No, this can't be real. But it was. And the more they looked around, the more they realized the truth. The people, if you could call them that, were waiting for them. The 4th floor wasn't just a forgotten part of the building. It was a trap, a place where people came and never left the same. The figures closed in on them, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were pressing in. Jenna grabbed Mark's hand, pulling him back toward the stairs, but the door had closed behind them. They were trapped. "We have to get out," Jenna whispered, her voice shaking. But as they turned, the faces of the figures shifted, their expressions changing, twisting into something terrible. "They're not leaving," the figure from the corner said, its voice now a low growl. "Not ever." And as the walls closed in around them, the last thing they saw was the door to the 4th floor slowly closing, sealing them in. The house at the edge of town had claimed 2 more souls, and the people who lived on the 4th floor were waiting for the next to arrive. Story number 10. The House of Forgotten Dreams. When Laura first stepped into the house, she was enchanted. It was exactly what she had been looking for: spacious, elegant, with large windows that let in the sunlight, and an old charm that modern houses simply couldn't match. The house had once belonged to a famous architect, Arthur Hawthorne, whose name was known throughout the city. He had designed the house in the 1920s, and it was said to be his masterpiece, a place where his vision had truly come to life. But it had been abandoned for years, and now it was hers, after a long search for a place to call home. The house stood on a quiet street, its stone facade weathered by time. The moment Laura moved in, she felt a strange pull, something that made her heart race and her thoughts cloud over. It wasn't fear exactly, but an undeniable sensation that the house knew her in a way she couldn't quite understand. At first, the house seemed perfect. The high ceilings, the grand staircase, the light that streamed in through the tall windows. Every room had a history to it, a story etched into the walls, the floors, the furniture. But there was something else too, a tension in the air, a heaviness that clung to the house like dust. It started with the dreams. The first one came the second night after she moved in. She had fallen asleep in the master bedroom, her new bed feeling strangely uncomfortable, as though it didn't quite belong. The dream was vivid, more real than any dream she had ever had. She was walking through the house, but it was different. It was alive, filled with light and music. In the dream, she saw a man, tall, thin, with sharp features and dark eyes. He was standing by a drawing board, pencil in hand, sketching something on a large piece of paper. It was Arthur Hawthorne. He looked at her, and without saying a word, he motioned for her to come closer. As she stepped forward, she saw the plans he was working on, a strange, intricate design, but there was something unsettling about it. The lines of the house twisted and turned, curving in unnatural ways, almost as though the plans themselves were alive. Then, just as quickly as it began, the dream shifted. The house darkened, the light fading from the walls. The man was no longer sketching, but instead standing at the center of the room, looking lost, his face drawn with sorrow. The sound of a door slamming echoed in the dream, and Arthur turned to face her, his eyes wide with something like fear, but he didn't speak. He just pointed toward the darkened hallway. When Laura woke up, the dream lingered in her mind like a heavy fog. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her, something hidden in the house. She thought it was just a dream, just her mind trying to process the new surroundings, but the dreams kept coming, each one more vivid, more detailed than the last. In the following nights, Laura found herself dreaming about Arthur's life. She saw glimpses of his time in the house, moments of joy and creativity, but also of isolation and despair. She watched him design the house, putting every inch of his soul into it. But she also saw the cracks forming, his personal life unraveling, his growing obsession with the house, and the strange darkness that seemed to follow him. The house was no longer just a place, it was a living thing, breathing in time with her, and it was drawing her in, bit by bit. As Laura explored more rooms, she began to notice things, small details she hadn't seen before. Drawings tucked behind old books on shelves, scraps of paper hidden in corners. The more she pieced together, the more she realized Arthur's obsession had not just been with the house but with something darker. Something had happened here, something that had twisted him, changing his mind, his vision, and his very soul. The dreams began to feel like memories, like pieces of her own past. She woke up each night with an aching feeling in her chest, like she had lost something important, like the house was somehow pulling her into its tragic history. The boundary between the present and the past began to blur. Laura would find herself walking through the rooms in the dream, only to wake up and find herself standing in the same places, as though the house had moved her while she slept. She could almost feel Arthur's presence in every corner, like he was watching her, waiting for her to understand. One night, Laura found herself in the darkened hallway from the dream. She couldn't remember how she got there, but she knew she had to keep moving forward. The air was thick, and the walls seemed to close in around her. She reached the end of the hallway, and there it was, the door that had been locked in her dreams. In her hand, she found an old, rusted key, and without thinking, she inserted it into the door and turned it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was stale, and the walls were lined with old sketches, just like the ones she had seen in her dreams. But there was one drawing that caught her attention: Arthur's final design, the house. But this time, something was different. The floor plans were altered, the walls warped, the structure twisting in impossible ways. And then she saw it. The figure of Arthur standing in the corner, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He was no longer the confident architect, but a man consumed by something darker, something that had taken hold of him. Arthur's voice echoed in her mind. "You're part of it now, Laura. You always have been." The floor beneath her feet began to shift, the house groaning as if it were alive, and for the first time, Laura understood. The house wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a trap that had claimed Arthur, and now it was claiming her. As the walls closed in, she realized the truth. The House of Forgotten Dreams wasn't just waiting for her to uncover its secrets. It was waiting to take her, to pull her into the past and make her part of its tragic history, just as it had done to Arthur. And as the darkness swallowed her whole, she became a part of the house. Another lost soul trapped in its twisted design, forever bound to the architect's forgotten dreams.